Welcome everybody to a second panel in a series of 2 panels that are dedicated to new avenues in studying diaspora-homeland relations during the Cold War era. I just want to point out that both of those sessions were put together by Aigi Rahidam from Tartu University. My name is Liisi Esse. I work at Stanford University Libraries as curator for Estonian and Baltic Studies, and I'm also the administrative executive director of AABS. And today, I'm the humble chair of this panel. So, without further ado, I will be introducing our first speaker, Morten Baarvig Thomsen. He is a PhD fellow in history at the University of Southern Denmark, where he is currently writing a thesis on the experiences of displaced persons in Denmark from 1945 until 1953. He has previously worked as a historian at the Historical Collection from the Occupation and its associated Holocaust Education Center in Denmark. His research interests include refugee history, Holocaust history, and the history of humanitarianism. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm turned on. I am. That's good. Just give me a moment to... There we go. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak today. I'll begin the panel with a case study of Estonian exiles in the Danish public sphere. This is an image from a DP camp in Copenhagen, where you can see that the camp has been decorated to look like the capital of Estonia. And we'll briefly come back to this. Just to lay out my game plan for the presentation, I'll begin by introducing or giving you some historical context which I think is necessary to understand the life of exile in Denmark for Estonians and other Baltic individuals after World War II. I'll introduce my research questions, the theoretical foundation, and some methodology, so you know what material I'm working with and from what perspective I'm doing it. Then I'll go through the 2 cases that I've chosen to highlight today. The first one is August Kern, we'll come back to him, and the second one is the historian Velu Helk, hence the title of my presentation. And then I'll sum up at the end, trying to give you some broader perspectives based on my work. So I've already been introduced, so I won't do this again, just reiterating my main body of work and my main focus on my PhD is DPs in Denmark, rather understudied area, and I'd be more than happy to talk about this after my presentation if anyone is interested or knows any sources that I'm missing. Yeah, so some context. Estonians in Denmark, we do not have a large Estonian diaspora after World War II, but we do have a rather significant and historical important one, I think, because we did have a large amount of Baltic exiles coming to Denmark as part of the Great Flight of 1944 and 1945, and there are about 6,000 of them in total. And they were, to put it mildly, unwanted by the Danish state, so they were sought to be repatriated or pushed further abroad to Australia or Canada. It's a story you've heard before, I imagine. But about 1,200 DPs stayed in Denmark. I'm not quite sure the exact amount of Estonians, but it does mean that there was a small but active Baltic diaspora in Denmark after World War II, which we'll look into now. So what I noticed when I read the very few studies of Baltic exiles in Denmark is that a lot of them tend to focus on DP camps, individual locations, or diplomatic relations in a broad sense. So the relationship between Estonia, for instance, and Denmark, and the diplomatic actors who played a role in that process. There's not been a lot of focus on DPs or exiles in Denmark as political actors in their own right, meaning in the Danish context specifically. So what I want to do is, based on my interest in the public sphere as a theoretical concept, which is of course Habermas who spoke about this originally, and he describes it as a realm of our social life in which something approaching public opinion can be formed, where citizens behave as a public body when they confer in an unrestricted fashion about matters of general interest. He also says that the sphere, Öffentlichkeit, is open to all. Based on this foundation, I want to explore exactly how Estonians acted in the Danish context. So my research questions are: how, when, and why did Estonian exiles participate in the Danish public sphere to argue for Estonian independence? So I'm narrowing my focus a little bit here. I hope you'll allow it. And what can this tell us about the wider experience of exile in Denmark? And my primary sources are first and foremost Danish newspapers. We have a very large collection of very well digitized and OCR'd newspapers in Denmark in general for the whole 20th century. And then also books, pamphlets, and other published material related to the exiles that I will investigate in the presentation. So there's a huge body of different work here. So I draw on two quite exceptional cases for this study. The first one is August Kern, who I imagine some of you will know. He was an Estonian diplomat in Denmark before the Soviet occupation, and he stranded in Denmark after 1940 and refused to return home. And he then remained as an unofficial representative of Estonia in the Danish diaspora and in Denmark in general. And you'll probably know him from his work in the Association of Captive European Nations, if you know of him at all, or as part of the Estonian exile government as well. The second case is Velo Helk, who is a Danish historian who came to Denmark as a refugee or a demobilized soldier, I should say, in 1945. He fought for the Germans, although in a supportive role mainly. He left the DP camps in Denmark quite early and studied history at Aarhus University, and he then became quite a prominent historian of the early modern period in Denmark. And he was active in various Estonian organizations, some of his life mostly after independence in 1991. And what I argue is that these two individuals are, in an idealized sense, ideal spokespersons for Estonian independence in Denmark during the Cold War and after. And I'll move on from this assumption based on the idea that you all agree, and then we move into the actual study. So if we start with August Kern, who was, as I mentioned, a diplomat, he was quite active in the public sphere, but he did not start before 1956. So there's not a lot of material in what I've looked through, him speaking out about Soviet occupation before 1956. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that he was more active in assisting Estonian refugees in Denmark in the DP camps. So providing them with residence permits, identity documents, and just generally arguing their case when he had the ability and the opportunity to. There's another possible factor, and that is that in most of this period here, the Cold War had not really frozen over in a Danish context. It wasn't until 1949 that we joined the Atlantic organization, NATO, and criticism of the Soviet Union was rather not necessarily universally popular before 1956, when the Hungarian Revolution made it very clear to most Danes that there was a problem with the Soviet system. So that's probably also a factor why he did not speak out. If we look at his activity after 1956, I think he started to do more interviews, more lectures, he published more material, and he also was active in just generally spreading Estonian culture at exhibits and in articles and in various thank you letters in the Danish press. And what I think is interesting about him is that his activism is not static when you look across the period I'm investigating. You could imagine, I think, that arguing for Estonian independence would be the same rhetoric again and again. Estonia should be independent, Denmark should recognize that Estonia is an occupied country, and then we repeat that for 50 years. But that's not actually what happens when you look in the material. He's a constant, though, is that he's always arguing that the occupation of Estonia is legal in international law, and therefore anything going on in Estonia is illegal from an international perspective. But after that, he does change his rhetoric quite often. In 1956, 1958, the Hungarian Revolution is held up as a mirror to the Estonian situation and compared constantly, I think in an effort to make the Estonian situation more relevant to the Danish press. And then in the 1960s, which I think is very interesting, he is arguing that Estonia is a colony that is unaffected by decolonization, explicitly comparing it to what's going on in Africa at the same time, so the decolonization that's rapidly going on at the same time. And then in the 1970s, he doesn't speak as much, but he's still active in the Danish press, especially calling out what he sees as Soviet hypocrisy when he is able to and when there's an opportunity. Here is an example of some of his rhetoric. He's saying that the lust for freedom of the 70 to 80 million oppressed Europeans can spark just as it happened in Hungary, and the knowledge of this is no less a deterrent to the Soviet holders of power than the H-bomb. essentially arguing that if you want to keep the Soviet Union at bay from expanding outside their own borders, engaging into armed conflict, you must support Estonian and other Eastern Europeans, their fight for freedom, to make the Soviets nervous about doing anything before they had the internal situation under control. Here is some rhetoric describing Estonia as a forgotten Soviet colony. Is it not frightening that the fight for freedom in Africa was talked about more than the lack of freedom in Eastern Europe? We remember Africa, but we forget our neighbors. Eastern Europe must not be forgotten for Africa. And here is a description of the Eastern European situation. The people's attempts at open revolt have been crushed, and no help came from abroad despite troops being sent to Africa. So there's also some sort of an indignation that world interest is going towards Africa and not Eastern Europe. If we turn our attention to Velo Helg, the second part of my analysis, he is not really active before 1989 with a few exceptions, but when he is active, he is the most active of these two men. He becomes probably the most active pro-Estonian advocate in a Danish context after 1988. And he writes extensively on Estonian history from his own perspective, partly based on literature, but also partly based on his own experiences. And his special focus is on the Russian-speaking population in Estonia, which he sees as illegitimate citizens and a possible fifth column in Russia's future schemes of invasion or annexation. I think quite precedent in our current situation, unfortunately. And he is interesting, I think, because he is first and foremost a historian. So when he argues, he constantly mobilizes history to win over the Danish population. And he does this by drawing on the memory of the German occupation of Denmark, probably the one event that every Danish citizen will know a lot about and will have some general knowledge of and strong opinion of. And he's saying that this is comparable to what is still going on in Estonia and what has happened since 1945. And then he also highlights Russia as a possible threat to independence even at the end of history. So saying, yes, of course things have changed now that the Soviet Union no longer exists, but if we look historically, Russia will always be some sort of a threat to Estonian independence. On the Russian minority in Estonia, here's an example. He's saying that they constitute a Trojan horse, which will at first chance break down the border to reunite with their countrymen. And here we see the corpse of the Soviet Union being a threat to nice and peaceful Estonia sitting below. This is from one of the newspaper articles. Another example here, drawing on the historical perspective, that Estonia has been occupied 10 times as long as Denmark was and has lost 1/4 of its original population. Here he's arguing that the reason Estonians have such animosity towards Russians is because of this situation, and this is an attempt to make it more palatable to a Danish audience, I think. So why, when, and how did Estonian exiles participate based on these two cases? Well, the why is relatively easy to answer, I think. There is an attempt at countering pro-Soviet and pro-Russian arguments from both of these men. Kern has a special interest in encouraging Western support for Estonia, which I think comes across all the time in his writing. And there's an idea of keeping the flame alive, saying that Estonia and independent Estonia must not be forgotten. There's still something to fight for. It has not died out despite the Soviet occupation. And Helg is heavily focused on countering Danish misconceptions of the Estonian situation and of Estonian history. So when do they talk? Well, they talk after 1956, after the Hungarian Revolution especially. They talk during the decolonization in Africa from the 1960s onwards, and they talk a lot during the opening and collapse of the Eastern Bloc in the late 1980s. And I think in general you could say they talk during world events with some sort of direct, perceived or constructed relevance to the Estonian Baltic question. Especially the decolonization in Africa is an attempt to make the question relevant to what's going on in the world more broadly. And how do they talk? Well, Kern, as I mentioned, uses legal arguments and utilizes current world events to argue his case. Helg works by countering historical misconceptions and uses Danish public memory of the past to do this. And in short, they use highly adaptable rhetoric based on the expertise of their background. So Kern had a diplomatic background, a legal background, and Helg has a background as a historian, and that is what they base their rhetoric on, their personal expertise. And what can we say about the wider experience of exile in Denmark based on the writings of these two men? I think one thing is very clear, and that is that Estonian exile is connected with a sense of great frustration. And this comes across especially in Viljo Helk's writings. On the Danish attitudes, he writes, "When I once mentioned the Soviet deportations at a debate meeting in Aarhus in the 1950s, people would not believe me. The Soviets do not deport people without a reason." And this is a quite prominent Danish editor of a very large newspaper who's saying this in the late 1950s. Here he's saying that during the Soviet occupation, Danes preferred to repress the uncomfortable facts, and now many Danes cannot understand why the Baltic people have a deep-seated mistrust of Russians. The Baltic countries were not occupied at all, but that they are a natural part of Russia. This is a thing he's saying that Danes generally think. And I think another part of the frustration comes into something we don't see in the writings, and that is that both men had the experience of their op-eds, their articles, being rejected by Danish editors because they were either not relevant or they were perceived as not important, or generally just reiterating the same argument. So there's also a lack of access to the public sphere that these exiles experience. And that is probably the main takeaway, that the Danish public sphere is not open to all, especially not Baltic exiles in this period. And my ultimate point, I think, by doing this small case study is that if we research and look into exile vernacular public sphere activism, vernacular here as the local language of the area that they end up living in, I think we can unearth new perspectives on exile history, on Baltic history, and on the diasporas of the Baltic nations in general. And on that note, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Kristine Bekere. She is a researcher at the Institute for Latvian History at the University of Latvia, and she is also the editor-in-chief of Journal of the University of Latvia History. Her research interests include Latvian diaspora around 1918, Latvian diaspora after World War II, and diaspora diplomacy. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who has come today to hear this panel. And we will speak today about a very vibrant, very important time, the late 1989, late 1980s, early 1990s, the time when everything changes in the Baltic countries. And everything changes also in the diaspora. So late 1980s saw a fundamentally new approach emerging in the national political activities, national political attempts of the Latvian diaspora. And it is most visibly manifested by the creation of Latvian Popular Front support groups abroad, worldwide. And this shift in diaspora general attitude from suspicion and distrust to the home country, country of the origin, to close cooperation with it. It happens through a very, in a very short time period, in a year or so. And this change represents an essential general reorientation of diaspora efforts from attempts to create outside pressure to supporting political changes in the Baltic states, inside the Baltic states. And I was struggling on how to put this change into like one phrase. And yesterday in one of the panels, a researcher from the National Library of Lithuania, I think I see you here now, Valda was the name, or okay, gave me this formula, how to formulate this in a few words. So it's a shift from diplomacy by diaspora to active partnership. And this phenomena is what I will be talking about today. But first, before we go to that, we have to shortly look into both parties. I will not repeat all this. It's probably mostly known to everyone. The Latvian Popular Front is the movement for restoration of the independence of Latvia. counterpart of Sąjūdis in Lithuania and Rahvar in Estonia. And the Latvian diaspora, I'm talking about the part that arrived after the Second World War. And here you see the most important points, characteristics of this group of people. And what is the most important in context of my today's talk is this final row you see, the methods that they used, which mostly looked like this. It's a public demonstration in Australia specifically. But the point that I wanted to stress here is that this is how diaspora promoted their political goal of restoring Baltic states' independence, mainly by political lobby work and by engaging with the society through such public demonstrations, public activities. And so we come to the phenomenon of Latvian Popular Front support groups outside Latvia. There were, of course, a lot of such groups also inside Latvia in different towns, different organizations. We don't touch them today. We're just looking at the groups that are in the West. So basically the area of Latvian exile post Second World War. Here's also a short characteristic of these groups. It's important to stress that these groups are very diverse, and it's not easy to really follow their history sometimes, because as with many voluntary organizations, some of them never register their activities officially. Some of them do that but never really do any real work. So it's all kind of fluctuating, but there are at least 25 of them in all kind of countries that you see here. The groups in Sweden and Australia are specific because they evolved and operated in a closer manner to the Latvian Popular Front in a formal capacity of formal chapters of the organization. Yes, the first group organized was in Sweden. It was admitted to the Popular Front as a group already in the founding Congress of the Popular Front, which is kind of interesting, but at the same time testifies to the connection between the groups already before the formal organization. The membership of these groups, so the size of them, is also very, very diverse. We have really groups where there is only 1 or 2 people. Switzerland is one of the examples. And we have up to 200, which would be Chicago. And also, yes, the activity of them is mostly during 89, 90. Some of them continue to operate longer, again with Sweden being the most prominent example and working till 1999. Most of the groups, however, especially in the United States, they ceased their activity in 1993 because the general election was held in Riga at that year, and Popular Front participated as a political party. And by the US NGO laws, the groups couldn't support a political party of the other country, so they just changed the focus mostly. Yes. So, from these groups, I would like, before we go further, to just mention one group which will be important in the context of what I will be speaking next. That is the support group in Toronto, Canada, established under the auspices of the Latvian Arts Trust Society. It was an organization there founded in 1984, so relatively late. And it was one of the first diaspora organizations to take an important practical step in supporting the awakening processes here in the Baltic states, namely by publishing in a separate printed volume the resolution and papers of the plenary meeting of creative unions held in Riga in 1988. So the famous meeting where for the first time taboo topics such as occupation of Latvia, the influx of migrants, Russification, such topics were for the first time publicly discussed. So this organization made these papers publicly available. So you would think that creating a Popular Front support group was a logical next step. So we come to also an important point, to functions of these groups. What was their what did they do? This is also a topic that I would like to explore further and more in depth in some future research. So for now, I will just sketch the main points. Of course, they continued the traditional approach of the traditional diaspora organizations, with political lobby work, with organizing demonstrations, all kinds of such activities, public relations, you would say. But there comes the bonus activities which make this case special, namely material assistance, information supply, and mediation in foreign visits. So direct connections with the emerging nationalistic movement with the Latvian Popular Front, with the first already state official persons of the new government. And that is extremely important and something absolutely new in the diaspora activities up to this point. Sending something physically to Latvia, to some people there. And the relative importance of this, well, as I said, it still needs more in-depth research to be able to quantify all the amount of computers, video recorders, tapes, just simple material assistance money that was funneled into the independence movement operating within the Baltic states, mainly the main recipient being the Latvian Popular Front. As far for today, I can just give you a quote by Dainis Ivans, who was the chairman of the Latvian Popular Front at the time, and he writes in his memoirs that the arrival of the first computer equipment in Latvia, purchased and sent by Latvian Popular Front support groups, is that what gave the edge for the Popular Front over the Interfront. This ability to put together the newspaper on the computer, simply to disseminate the information. So he values this practical help very highly. Okay, but we have to go back to our main topic today. How all this process, how does it influence diaspora, with the diaspora community as such? And here you see in the slide the different attitudes that were prevalent in the diaspora society in regards to necessity or even advisability to create such popular front groups. The supportive attitudes are, of course, easily understandable. It's a feeling that we want to do everything possible to help our country of origin and variations of this feeling. But what is more important for us today, and probably more interesting, is the negative feelings. One of the top arguments against such cooperation is the fear of the Communist Party influence on the Latvian Popular Front. And opinions here in the diaspora ranged from the very extreme, from a belief that the Popular Front is really a project made up by the Communist Party and with an aim to harm the diaspora specifically, and of course up to the more reasonable and, well, really completely reasonable attempts to just remind other people that, yeah, we should be careful and see if the Popular Front goes into the wrong direction, we should take our support back and all like that. Then there is the other attitude, the widespread call against the formation of support groups was not to fragment the forces of diaspora. And it comes together with very closely together with the third point. Many of these arguments, public arguments against forming such groups, against cooperating with the independence movement inside Baltic countries, is that the existing organizations, diaspora organizations that have been around since 1950s, some even earlier, they are afraid to lose their influence, simply as that. They somehow, there is this, this notion, it's sometimes spelled out quite openly, sometimes it's implied that it is an actual prerogative, so actually a right of the central political diaspora organizations to be the actors that achieve the independence of the Republic of Latvia, and not some, well, who are these people who are creating these Popular Front support groups. So this was also a very powerful motivation against such cooperation. Yes, so what we see here is a separateness of the group's activities. The people that create these groups are almost 100% not participants of like traditional, long existing diaspora organizations. Yes, so, and we can, so far for the attitudes, but to complete this thought of mine that I wanted to present today, we have to follow through the change of this attitude, how these negative attitudes are overwhelmed and transformed into a very close cooperation. And that this change in the attitude is best followed if we see through 3 meetings between diaspora and Latvian Popular Front members. The first of them would be the American Latvian Association's Extraordinary Congress, late 1988. And 2 Latvian Popular Front board members were it was just a chance that they were in the United States at the time, and they were invited to participate in the Congress. Sandra Kalniete specifically was given the floor to address the meeting. She later remembered that the reception there in this Congress was quite positive, but later diaspora media, the reaction from diaspora media as such were really, really negative, up to the point that the president of the American Latvian Association at the time was compelled to publicly explain the organization's position, to kind of say, no, we're not like cooperating with communists and addressing all these fears that I talked about. So that was just the first beginning, with mainly negative response. The second and very important one, where the Toronto group comes into account, is the Popular Front's first major visit outside the Iron Curtain as such, and to the North America specifically. Quite a long time, as you see, almost a month. A huge delegation of 23 people, Popular Front leadership, leading scientists, cultural figures, just the intellectual elite of the time, visited different Canadian scientific institutions, gave lectures at diaspora centers, spent few days, 10 days, also in the United States. And the most famous part of all this huge visit was the Gananokva conference from 6 to 9 April. So just a meeting between this delegation that arrived and different diaspora organization representatives, discussion groups, speaking about ecology, academic exchange, speaking about economic, legal, agricultural topics. Just exchanging this information between what's happening in Latvia, what diaspora could help to improve the situation. And it has to be stressed here that it sounds very easy today to just invite people over. They fly to the United States, they have a meeting, they fly back. It was far from that easy at that time. This group in the Toronto practically organized all this event. They gathered money for it to bring these 23 people to the United States. They divided responsibility for these people, so basically the diaspora people took each either 1 or 2 guests in their homes to house them for this month. They also had to do all the legal things, you had to write a letter of invitation so that this person could apply for a visa to go to the States. So that was a huge amount of work, huge amount of money, and initiative that is, that is basically easy to overlook how much it meant to just organize a conference. So it's not easy today, but it was much more complicated then. Okay, and then we come to the third and most important event. Yeah, okay. And here I have to say that up to this point, and including the Gananokva conference, the leading Latvian diaspora organization, the World Federation of Free Latvians, never participated in all these activities. They were strictly distancing themselves from all this going on, distancing with a negative exclamation mark. So this third meeting in France, May 1989, is the first time when the World Federation of Free Latvians really engage. They are forced to acknowledge that things have gotten very far, and they also have to kind of engage with this movement. They initiate this meeting. 8 members of the Popular Front come to this meeting, and the same as in Gananokva, there are a lot of discussion groups about all kinds of topics concerning Latvia. But what is important and different from the Gananokva, that here the diaspora party is, in this time, it's official people from official diaspora organizations. And the World Federation of Free Latvians adopts a resolution during this meeting that is, positive for once. And I quote, "The Federation observes and follows with great interest the organization and activities of the Popular Front in Latvia and supports all efforts of the Latvian Popular Front that strengthen the position of the Latvian people and contribute to Latvia's regaining full independence." And basically, with this meeting in Abrane, and of course after the Second Congress of the Popular Front, where they publicly declared that their aim is independence, this word comes up publicly and officially, we can speak about the conclusion of this process, of this change from diplomacy by diaspora to active cooperation. Yeah, that's how the meetings in Abrane looked like. Well, and just very shortly to conclude everything of that, these support groups are a grassroots movement within the diaspora, something outside the established organizational structure. The importance of personal contacts in this change of attitude is very strongly evident. You see that whenever you take any memoirs, any memories you want from the people who participated, they always stress that, okay, some person from Latvia, from the Popular Front, came to Australia or Sweden or whatever. We listened to him and we understood that we can work together. And the support groups were those that were ensuring that these contacts could happen by giving their money, giving their time, organizing that. And so these support groups are forerunners of this change of attitude. And at the last point, this phenomena of these groups, the rapid emergence of them, their activity, it reveals the multi-layered nature of the diaspora society in the late 1980s. When we research diaspora history, and I know that I'm guilty of that too, we tend to research it as the history of central diaspora organizations, because that's the easiest way, they have meeting documents, they have materials to research. But the emergence of these support groups of people who were mostly never part of other, they just give us something to think about, that maybe there's more to it than just the organizations. I'm sorry, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristine. Our third speaker is Morten Gumiela. He's a PhD candidate and scientific coordinator at the University of Vienna. He is also an external lecturer at the Vienna University of Economics and Business and an associate in the research project A Breach in the System, the Polonia Firms from 1976 through 1999. Morten is currently finalizing his dissertation, where he explores Austrian Polonia firms in late-stage socialist Poland as private SMEs that were officially founded by members of the Polish diaspora in Austria.
All right. So thank you very much for the introduction. So today I'm talking about formal and informal business relations between the Polish diaspora and state socialist Poland. And as I was already introduced, I'm finalizing my PhD within a bilateral research project which is partly funded by the Austrian Science Fund FWF and the Polish National Science Center. So as you can see, the project is coming to an end, and I hopefully will submit my thesis in late June or early July. But when we talk about the relationships between the state socialist regime in People's Poland and the diaspora, we have to start in the mid-1950s, where there was a shift of the legitimization of power in the state socialist regime from a class-related legitimization towards a nationalist one. So in the mid-1950s, the diaspora, which is called, like broadly known, the Polonia, became important for the state socialist regime. So there was an organization founded in 1955, which was named the Polonia Organization, and its major task was to start and then foster mostly cultural relations with the diaspora organizations, mostly in the West, so in the US, in the UK, but also in other Western European countries. But when we talk about the starting point of formal economic relations between People's Poland and diaspora entrepreneurs, so-called Polonia entrepreneurs in the West, the rebuild of the Warsaw Castle played a crucial role. So after Edward Gierek took power in 1970 in People's Poland, he tried to foster even more the relations with the Western Polonia, and at the same time he tried to strengthen and start economic relations. And we have to understand this, of course, in the context of the ongoing détente and ongoing globalization and growing East-West economic relations at that time. So as you can see, hopefully, at the quote here from the Austrian ambassador in People's Poland in Warsaw, the Polonia organizations played a crucial role in the rebuild of the Warsaw Castle, which was blown up by German troops during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. So there was a huge campaign of collecting money for the rebuild of the Warsaw Castle among diaspora organizations. And as you can see, even anti-communists participated in this campaign of the rebuild of the Warsaw Castle. And this was kind of a point where the regime saw a huge financial potential among the diaspora. And when we go on, we can see that already in 1972, the foreign trade company Polymar was founded. And Polymar was, the main task of this company was to conduct trade relations with so-called Polonia companies, so enterprises in the West, private enterprises in the West, which were led by members of the Polonia. So the Polonia enterprises in the West had to be favorite dealers for the growing Polish exports to the West at that time. And here we can see a list which I found in the archive, in the Warsaw archive of the Archiwum Akt Nowych, a list of Polonia companies in the West which could be potential trade and cooperation partners for the foreign trade company Polymar. So when we continue, we then have in May 1976 the first legal possibility for founding small and medium-sized foreign-owned private enterprises in People's Poland, and they were then commonly known Polonia firms, because although there was no legal regulation that only Poles from abroad could found such companies, most of these company founders were actually members of the Polish diaspora. So the first legal framework was in May 1976, and the first Polonia firms in People's Poland, they were already founded in 1977, and as you can read, the state socialist propaganda, of course, didn't frame this opportunity for foreign direct investment in a state socialist economy as kind of a liberalization of the economy, but as kind of a patriotic duty of Polonia entrepreneurs in the West to invest in People's Poland. And here again, we have to keep the broader context in mind, because at that time in 1976, the debts of People's Poland in the West were rising rapidly, and the whole state socialist economy was turning into a huge crisis that was getting even worse in the early 1980s. So when we have a closer look on the Polonia firms, as I already mentioned, they were small and medium-sized enterprises. They were 100% foreign-owned by Western Polonia entrepreneurs. The seed capital for these enterprises had to be in so-called convertible Western currency, so there was a mandatory regulation that the seed capital had to be in hard currency. And the firm owners, they were mostly members of the Polish diaspora, but at the same time, these founders had to name proxies who then operated as the managers of these companies on site. And the Polonia firms usually engaged in the production of consumer goods, but they also operated, for example, in the construction industry. And when you take a closer look on the development of the foundations, we can see that until 1980, there were just a small number of Polonia firms. And then we have, in the worst crisis times, so especially during the martial law in People's Poland, we have the highest increase of new firms foundations. And then we can see that after 1983, there is a slump of newly founded firms. And until 1989, there are different numbers of these firms, but around between 800 and 1,000 firms were operating at that time in People's Poland with more than 70,000 employees. So why there was a slump after the end of the martial law? Because the most liberal period for founding such firms was actually during martial law, and then the legal situation became much more restricted, although in the second half of the 1980s there were economic reforms going on, which at the same time opened up the state socialist economy for already big investments from the West. And for example, since 1986 there was a legal possibility to found joint ventures between state-owned companies in People's Poland and Western enterprises. So we also have to keep in mind that these Polonia firms were not the first possibility for private enterprises in state socialist Poland, because there was a tiny and heavily restricted private sector in People's Poland throughout its existence, and beside the non-collectivized agriculture. However, Polonia firms from the beginning have had much more legal privileges. They could employ much more people than the so-called traditional craft sector enterprises, which just could employ up to, depended on like 7 or 8 people, were heavily taxed. Polonia firms, or at least some of them, already had 200 employees, for example, in the early 1980s. So just to briefly introduce some of these Polonia firms, here you can see on the right, we have the Polonia firm Alpha. It was founded in 1977 by an Austrian Polonia entrepreneur. And as you can imagine, Alpha was producing zippers for, in Krakow. Another Polonia firm was into fragrances. It was founded by a Polonia entrepreneur from France. And here again, you can imagine it was producing perfumes and fragrances. So here you can see the smell and the guy enjoying the beautiful smell of fragrances, perfumes. Another well-known Polonia firm was the Polonia firm Haste or Hasta. In Polish, there are different spellings of this company name. It was founded by a diaspora entrepreneur from Sweden, and it was producing furniture, for example, folding chairs. And they could be very useful during the worst years of economic crisis in people's Poland, as we can see. So to now switch a bit more from these formal business ties between People's Poland and the Polonia in the West, I would like to zoom into case studies that are from my research, because I'm writing my PhD on so-called Austrian Polonia firms. So approximately 70 firms that were founded with seed capital from Austria, and most of them were founded by members of the Austrian Polonia. So we can see here that in the first case, there was already the experience of having a private enterprise in People's Poland already in the mid-1950s, because this person, and I conducted an interview and I was asked to anonymize. So this person founded a small craft enterprise which specialized in the distribution of pharmaceutics from the UK. And they received the pharmaceuticals from a relative who lived in the UK since 1939. He left at the beginning of the Second World War. And so here we can see cross-border and cross-block family ties, which contributed to this micro-family business already in the 1950s. Then the person migrated to Austria in the late 1960s, and in the early 1970s, she founded a trading company in Vienna and engaged in business relations with People's Poland at that time. And as we can see, in 1977, there was the first foundation of a Polonia firm, and actually her Polonia firm belonged to one of the first Polonia firms in general. And already in the early 1980s, we can see that her daughter, who also migrated in the mid-1970s, also to Austria, founded Polonia firms as well. So we can see a long tradition of family business going on throughout decades, actually, in different forms. So starting with this micro-family business in People's Poland, and then going on and moving on in Austria, and then founding in the late 1970s and early 1980s Polonia firms in People's Poland. So the second 2 minutes. So the second case, we have an enterprise founder in People's Poland, also in the mid-1950s, and this small craft enterprise was specialized in renovating old German graves on the territory of People's Poland in the late 1950s. So here again, we have a migration to Belgium and close business ties to the Belgian Polonia at the time, and he became a business partner of a Polonia trading company in Belgium, which was already engaged in trading relations with People's Poland. In the early 1960s, this person moved to Vienna, and together with his wife, they both became commercial agents for Polish state-owned enterprises, namely Cepelia and Textile Impex. And since 1977, both founded Polonia firms in People's Poland, and throughout the 1980s, they owned several Polonia firms in People's Poland. So to come to an end, so from the state's perspective, it seems to be obvious. The Polonia became an economic icebreaker for People's Poland's economic relations with the West. First, in the 1970s, to foster trade relations in the ongoing détente and globalization with the West. And then, in the 1980s, with the Polonia firms, to start and foster or start the possibilities for foreign direct investments in People's Poland, because Polonia entrepreneurs who founded Polonia firms were kind of the pioneers, but then they were followed by entrepreneurs from the West who also started to found such small and medium-sized private enterprises in People's Poland. However, they had no diaspora background anymore. But when you have a closer look to come to an end, at the motivation of the Polonia entrepreneurs themselves, so many of them identified themselves as anti-communists. However, this was not a barrier to start economic relations with People's Poland, and there were already some surveys in the late 1970s and in the 1980s. And the main motivation was, besides supporting their relatives in People's Poland and friends, so the main reasons were economic profits. And also, the main reasons for not founding Polonia firms in People's Poland were economic, because many of Polonia entrepreneurs considered People's Poland as a too risky market. So here we have mostly economic debates, not so much ideological and political ones. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much. Our last speaker is Lars Fredrik Stöcker. He's a historian working on the transnational history of Northern, East Central and Eastern Europe. He holds a PhD in history and civilization from the European University Institute in Florence and the habilitation in newest and contemporary history from the University of Vienna. And currently he's working as the PI for the project that has already been mentioned, A Breach in the System, the Polonia Firms from 1976 until 1994.
What we want to do in the project is to shed light on transnational diaspora entrepreneurship. If you check out this term, you will find literature, especially in the social sciences at the moment. We have global flows of migration, we have the global Indian economy, we have the Vietnamese. This is the topics you might find when you look up the term. You don't find much of the discussion when you go back to the Cold War area. And there's a lot of diaspora research going on when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe between 1945 and the end of the Cold War. And here we're speaking of new avenues in diaspora-homeland relations in this wonderful two-part panel by Aigir Ahitam. Basically what has been done is especially the relationship between the diaspora and the host society, adaptation, political activism. We have heard the paper by Kristine Bekere, and also links to the anti-communist opposition. We hear much less, or we have much more less knowledge about diaspora individuals, representatives as economic agents in the Cold War. There is a second strand of literature which you might be familiar with, the so-called socialist globalization debate, which argues basically that the economic reintegration of what was called the Second World happened during the Cold War and not after the Cold War, like going against the mainstream of globalization theories. Here, especially focusing on the early 70s as the kind of breaking point where socialist regimes opened up to transnational capital flows, flows of economic cooperation that went beyond mere trade. And this is summed up in this quote I'm giving by Besnik Pula, who says it's basically all kinds of economic cooperation that goes beyond mere import-export relations. I want to go back partly to Martin's presentation trying to find a provisional roof for this whole discussion, to investigate the role of diaspora actors as economic agents in a globalizing economy that goes beyond the Iron Curtain, so to say. I think the most maybe well-known or most well-researched aspect is the case of China. We see that basically after the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping is opening up the Chinese economy to foreign investments, then especially targeting the Chinese diaspora, which was sizable. It was estimated to be at about 90 million Chinese living abroad. They're called in Chinese overseas Chinese, even if Southeast Asia was not overseas from our perspective, but that's a translation from Chinese. The collective capital of the Chinese diaspora was estimated by Chinese economists at the time to be around $66 to $80 billion. So that was that were resources there that were to be targeted. And the Chinese authorities were first and foremost looking towards Southeast Asia, because as you see, that was the place where most Chinese overseas communities were concentrated. And officials of the PCR were touring, of the PRC were touring Southeast Asia, giving them prospects of VIP treatment and very profitable positions for starting transnational business. Here we see the very strong focus on Southeast Asia. The Chinese diaspora in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Macau, in Hong Kong was economically very strong and was seen to be behind the miracle of the Southeast Asian tiger states. So basically these were a very attractive target for the regime. And what you can see is that basically most of the investments made before 1989 were made in the coastal areas. These were the areas where the PRC was setting up the special economic zones as a kind of preferential treatment laboratories of opening up the economies, the economy to global flows of resources, financial resources and technologies. And basically, if we see that if we see overall that around 2/3 of all investments made in China come from these Chinese overseas communities, we can see that the diaspora played a key role in the economic globalization of the Chinese economy, which enabled also the Chinese leadership to pertain the political economy in the form as it is. Morten has presented this very intriguing case of the Polonia firms. Quite similar, because even here the Polish regime wanted to open up to global hard currency investments, hoping to be able to increase exports, to trigger technological flows, to modernize the economy. So basically the motive was the same. The Polish community scattered across the West was estimated to be around 12 to 14 million, which is a sizable group, but economically, of course, not as potent as the overseas Chinese communities. But still, the Polish government was especially targeting this group as potential investors. It was not specifically stated in this decree for foreign-owned companies, which was adopted in 1976. But the Polish authorities were working toward that direction. They were working with the consulates abroad, with the embassies, to promote this idea of investing in the homeland economy. Here playing very strongly on the strings of patriotism and as a kind of, you can be part of building up our homeland economy. And as Morten also said, this was an idea that most probably started with this patriotic unity around the rebuilding of Warsaw's destroyed castle. And these Polonia companies were quite undeservedly, I would say, neglected in research in Poland because they left a quite visible footprint in the collective memory. Like most of the older Poles at least know what the Polonia company was, because they were quite prominent in terms of they had modern illustrative art used for advertisements, also something that was hardly seen in Poland before that. They had quite fashionable items, they had a Western appearance, they were better quality, much overpriced, many would say, but very coveted items. So they were very present, and they were only allowed to operate in a very limited sector of the economy, only like non-dangerous sectors like light industry, like textiles, food products. But these were the things that were coveted, all the first computers, modern computers, which came to Poland through these firms. And we can see, maybe that is not visible from afar, some of the visiting cards of the time of these companies. We can see they have head office Vienna, trade office Warsaw. We have other companies which are in some small villages, not in Warsaw or Poznan. That was done for some preferential treatment reasons in the countryside. We have France here with a head office in some village also in Poland, or West Germany, where most of these investments came from. And some of these Polonia entrepreneurs really entered a road of fame, like Ignacy Soszyński. He's really an exception, I have to say, but he's like a big figure, everybody knows him. And he was one of the, he died in the 80s, but his successors were among the richest Poles even after 1991. If you see the list of the 20 richest Poles, in 1991, 10 of them, so half of them, were involved in this Polonia business. So that was some lasting impact on the Polish economy. Just to have a third comparative glimpse at a Baltic case study, here I take the case of the Estonian SSR, because the Soviet Union had quite similar motives of opening up the economy to capital and technologies later than other states in the Soviet bloc. So they were latecomers basically, but with the decree on joint ventures, even they allowed foreign capital investments to enter the domestic economy, and Estonia here played a leading role because it was geographically close to the West and producing sophisticated goods that might have a chance on the global export market. And they were also, because they were technologically and industrially quite well developed, they were the first Soviet republic with a known foreign trade association. And these foreign trade associations were also tasked with attracting foreign investments. And they did again basically the same thing as we have seen in China or in Poland. They were trying to focus on the diaspora as a potential group of investors. We see that here in the decree on the development of contacts with the Estonian emigration, that was at that time not official but a secret decree issued in October 1988, where it was stressed that we will give priority to cooperating with potential economic partners from the ranks of the diaspora community. So we see, Kristine has talked about Popular Front activists going to Toronto and to Sweden and so on, and we have the same thing in the Estonian case, famous economists who are going overseas or to Sweden to speak to the Estonian immigrant community to lobby for the Estonian path of reforms, to lobby for the thought of now you have the chance to help building up the Estonian economy to get more autonomy from Moscow. And just to see, okay, was this strategy successful? One short example we have, and here again, Toronto has come up before. This was in May 1989. We have a group of 30 representatives for the Estonian economy going to Toronto to be schooled in the rules of capitalism, basically. So it was a kind of improvised business school, which was co-organized by the Estonian Business Club in Canada. This was a club of Estonian emigres and second-generation emigres who were supporting Estonian-owned ethnic businesses in Canada. And basically, when you see what these 30 delegates wanted to do in Canada, if you see on the surveys, what is your aim? Finding joint venture partners was always, like making dollars was another aim, or learning how to make dollars, but finding joint venture partners was one of the big aims. And the outcome, well, we can see at least there is, for example, the very first Canadian-Soviet joint venture, which was basically an Estonian joint venture, if you want. It was Erwin Hopp, who was part of the Canadian immigrant community. He was partnering up with a dolomite mining company on the island of Saaremaa. So that was one of the outcomes of this cooperation. Another very famous, I think, for people who knew Estonia from the 1990s was Peoleo, which was a Western American style hotel or motel, I'm sorry, outside of Tallinn, and they were also having this very fancy burger place. Also American style, and this was also Lembit Soos. He was also from the Toronto community, and he was actually joining his brother back in Estonia who had a cooperative, so he was putting his money and his networks in. So, but all in all, we have to say that we don't see the same energy in Estonian diaspora representatives taking the role of being a foreign investor. I think the dynamics are the same as in the Latvian or Lithuanian case. There was a certain hope from the Republican governments to get the diaspora on board to build up the own economy in the framework as autonomous as it could become at the time. But all in all, the communities abroad were small and they didn't have as much capital. There was nothing to compare even with the Poles, not to speak of the Chinese. The other thing was that the immigration or the emigration or the escape of most Poles had taken place before the second invasion, the second occupation of the Baltic states. So basically here we had people who had little to no experience with the Soviet system. There was no trust, there was even not a willingness to engage in this experiment. Even though it was heavily propagated by also respected and well-liked representatives, economists and scientists and authority representatives coming to the bastions of the diaspora community in the West. And basically what we also can see is that especially the North American Estonian community was actively lobbying against investing. They said, okay, don't put your capital in because this is unethical. This is only going to the budget of the occupiers, so don't do that. So we see like a much stronger rejection of this idea than in the Polish case, for example. Well, to sum up of this improvised comparative outlook, what we can see is that basically the very different cases of the People's Republic of China, People's Republic of Poland, and the late Soviet Estonian SSR, is that the motives were quite similar of opening up the economy to transnational flows of capital and betting on diaspora compatriots as investors. What is important here, or a pattern that we start to see, is that basically family ties were important. Family ties or very strong friendships, because if you had somebody this is the transnational family outlook. If you have a relative in the country who might be your partner, then chances are much higher that you will engage in some kind of economic cooperation across what was then still the Iron Curtain. What we can also see is that from the government perspectives, we can see in all three cases that once this opening up of the domestic market happens, the regime completely changes its diplomacy vis-à-vis the compatriot communities, from total rejection and vilifying to playing on the patriotic strings, trying to getting them on board. And I think the Chinese comparison doesn't really make justice here, because the scales are so different. You cannot say that the diaspora investments into the Central and Eastern European states before the end of communism were immense or were a big game changer, but as Morten has said, there were at least icebreakers. They were the first bridges into the foreign markets, and the hope was that many others would follow the compatriots in the West. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for very interesting and very well laid out presentations. We now have solid 15 minutes for a discussion, so we're excited to hear your questions, comments, general wonderings, grievances, protests. questions about the meaning of life? Yes. The mic is coming. Please also introduce yourself.
Thank you. So my name is Airdas. I'm a PhD student at Georgetown University in political theory and European studies. I have a question to Morten on first presentation. So at the beginning of your presentation, you were discussing the size of the Baltic minorities in Denmark. So you mentioned that it fell from 4,000 to then 1,200, but that it is impossible to know the composition of this 1,200, right? If I understood correctly. I wonder if you know the reason for that. Is it that the Baltic refugees were kind of registered as somebody from the Baltic states? Were they not divided, per nationality in the registers?
Hello? I'm on. So the 1,200, in the final report made by the integration committee that was charged with putting people into society out of the camps, the number is not divided into nationality. Although I am sure there is a piece of paper somewhere in the Danish National Archives that will shed light on the exact composition. Another thing that makes it difficult is that we don't know the amount of those 1,200 that immigrated after 1953, when the Danish government essentially said, you're on your own. So I think in the final chapters of my thesis, I will answer that more specifically and hopefully try and see where these people went after the system of DP camps closed. But it is a good question, and I was very annoyed that I couldn't find the exact number when I was making the presentation. So thank you.
My name is Sirel Heinlo. I'm from University of Tartu, PhD candidate of literary studies. And actually, yes, similar question. In my Swedish research, I've noticed that when they use the term politics, they actually mean Estonians and Latvians. There are not so many Lithuanian refugees in Sweden, at least compared to Latvians and Estonians. And another thing, I've also noticed similar patterns, that a lot of attention paid to African literature and topics in the 60s, but maybe compared to the neighbors, this problematic is there. So thank you.
So we had one here and then over there.
Hi, my name is Katja Witzel from the University of Göttingen. I have first a question for Martin about Polonia firms. I'm just curious how, percentage-wise, approximately, how many were coming from Austria? And to what extent did they have a previous experience as an immigrant entrepreneur in Austria or elsewhere? Because this seemed to be the case with the case studies that you presented. And would you say that Austria was a good place for Polish entrepreneurs to set up a business and then from there go back home, so to say, as a diaspora entrepreneur? So I'm curious about that. And to Fredrik, sort of connected to this, how would you differentiate there's quite a lot of literature out there about immigrant entrepreneurship, and you started off with the case of overseas Chinese. To what extent would you differentiate between them being immigrant entrepreneurs versus then that case of diaspora entrepreneurship that you presented with regard to Poland and then Estonia?
All right. I'm on, hopefully, yes. Okay, so yes, Austria was among the top 5 most investing country, and I think the question is quite simple to answer because it was a neutral country. So we have also Swedish Polonia entrepreneurs who were also among the top 5 countries besides Western Germany and France. So yes, in my interviews that I have conducted, and I was not able to conduct many of them because there is still like a kind of a silence space surrounding these kind of enterprises and colonial firms. However, I was told that the environment for starting like cross-block entrepreneurial relations with People's Poland was particularly good from Vienna. So that's, I think, like Austria is a neutral state.
The example of this Estonian business club in Canada is a good example of that the authorities were quite they were quite strategically looking for somebody who also already had some businesses ongoing or some business experiences. We can see the same thing in the Polish case. I think you just scratched upon that. Before this decree was adopted, we can see that there was very much cooperation going on with Polish-owned businesses abroad, and I think this is a common thread in all three case studies, that compatriots were targeted who already had some kind of experiences in transnational business. Also, they were particularly invited to come with their capital resources and with their networks, of course. And the interesting thing to see in this in the case study of the Estonian Business Club in Canada, which was an interest organization of entrepreneurs of Estonian origin, is that they got very much involved into the reform project, but not as investors, but as economic advisors. You can see several government ministers in the transition government, but also after 1991, who were part of this Estonian business club in Canada. So I think as a kind of nucleus, it's important to see what kind of backgrounds these compatriots had and what kind of experiences they had in their luggage when they came.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Didzis Meltis. I'm from University of Latvia. You already partly actually answered my question. It's about favorable conditions comparatively. Like while this early bird capitalism came to Poland and not to Estonia or Latvia so early, and like lack of collectivization, for example, in Poland, and what were those factors behind this more favorable conditions?
What do you mean? What were the factors behind?
Well, what were the factors why this early capitalism kind of came to Poland, but not to Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia? It's not really capitalism. Like that's why I say early bird capitalism. So, you know, those Polonia enterprises. Yeah. Why not Livonia? Why Polonia? Why not Livonia? Yeah. There must be some favorable conditions in Poland. Like.
Do you want to co-answer? Yeah, please.
So just very briefly, because the Soviet Union was a latecomer in economic reforms. And we have countries like Hungary or Romania who enabled already in the early 1970s foundations of joint ventures with Western companies. And People's Poland was much more looking towards these solutions. And there is ongoing discussions and research what was actually the role of the Soviet Union in this like early liberalization reforms of the satellite states. So, but on the Soviet Union, I'm sure you could explain much better why it was a latecomer.
Well, that is basically self-explanatory, because the impetus for Poland, for example, to open up their domestic economy to transnational capital flows was to reduce the dependency on Moscow. And I think we see similar dynamics ongoing when the Baltic republics, as other republics in the Soviet Union as well, are increasing their autonomy. So basically, once you have a known foreign trade association, you have also to find own ways of attracting investments to build up your own hard currency funds. But the thing is, I think what makes this cooperation with the diaspora so specific is that you have to find ways of motivating investors, of enticing investors to get into this quite risky business, because the problem was, which was in common for all investors trying to enter the formally closed markets, is to get some legal protection. Do you have some Rechtsstaat framework for your investments? And that was only being built up gradually. And the idea was to get the diaspora into the boat, because they might have other motives than simple profit to engage here. So this was why the privileges were offered to potential investors, together with a whole package of appealing to patriotic sentiments, of a kind of new diplomacy across the Iron Curtain, not enmity but unity. So it was a whole package, and it was not only an economic investment, but also, it was a new way of framing unity and national interest across political boundaries.
Yes, Lee Björkman, University of Uppsala University, Sweden. I had a question to both, I guess, Fredrik and Morten. And maybe you touched upon this already, but I was thinking about how the relations between, local entrepreneurs, in Estonia, in Poland, and so on, and these diaspora entrepreneurs or teachers, sometimes, as we might call them. How did they develop over time? I compared it a bit to, the political sphere, which is more familiar to me. And there you can see that, particularly in some of these countries, the relations become very, tensions, or very almost hostile between, those who come back and try to teach the ones who have lived during communism. So I just wanted to know some more about, can you see that? Or can you see something else? Yeah.
There's an interesting thing. Basically, the thing was that there were very few local entrepreneurs in these very early phases, because private entrepreneurship was not possible. What we can see is that once, in the Polish case and also in the Soviet case, that once the legal regulations are in place to start transnational economic cooperation in the form of investments, that once this is in place, we see also a kind of dynamics from below in the socialist states. What is quite interesting is that many of these, I think you mentioned that shortly also, in the case of the Polonia firms, these new openings attracted the interest of very many cogs in the Polish economy. People who were working in foreign trade, or who were engaged in import-export relations with companies abroad. They saw a possibility of making profit, that was never really extinct. So basically we can see that many of these investments from the Polonia made a detour out of socialist Poland, hard currency savings. The Polish society had like $60 billion of hard currency savings in the country in the early 80s. And it was only $5,000, so they were transferred to a sister somewhere, to a relative abroad, who was then the official owner of the whole thing. So basically, this transnational diaspora entrepreneurship was sometimes local entrepreneurship with a little transnational flavor. In the Estonian case, we can also see that once the opportunities are there to form cooperatives, that the joint ventures were mostly of a slightly bigger format. Then you need a CEO who is an exile Estonian, who comes in with his company or with her company. But often we see, like in this Peoleo motel hamburger thing that basically the brother asks his brother to invest his capital. So it's a kind of family business across lines. So I don't really see here much of a competition, but rather of cooperation. And most of these exile Estonian investors that I have traced, at a certain point they went out of this business. They sold off their shares because they were not really fit to fight in the jungle of the early 90s. So I think they were really like quickly expelled from the domestic market. And in Poland we see some similar dynamics going on.
Yes, so in the Polish case, you can see there are some examples of that the founders are actually straw men or straw women, as Fredrik already mentioned, and the crucial like leaders or informal leaders of these enterprises are very often the proxies, or the managers on site. And they, many of them are former directors of state-owned companies. So they basically moved to the Polonia firms because they can earn much better money. They are privileged. They can travel. They have access to passports. They can go on business trips to Western countries much better than they were able to do so as directors or higher employees in state-owned companies. So there is a massive shift, and this was also heavily criticized by some more conservative or like ideologically orthodox party wings and state media.
All right, we are officially out of time. It's time for a coffee break or a walk, wherever your next session will take you. Thank you so much for a great discussion, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.